By the early 20th century, a majority of German and English Protestant scholars had gravitated toward the two-source hypothesis, which posited that the authors of Matthew and Luke had used the Gospel of Mark as a written source, and also another unknown source designated Q, German Quelle, meaning source, to account for the non-Marcan sayings and parables found in Matthew and Luke. The two-source hypothesis requires Mark's Gospel to be written first, contrary to all historical evidence and ecclesiastical tradition. Further, by making the Gospel of Matthew strongly dependent on that of Mark, it would seem implausible that the former was really written by Matthew the Apostle, again contradicting a unanimous and early tradition. The Muratorian canon talks about the second Gospel, in which it writes the following states, "Cabus tamen interfutiti ita posuit," which is translated as, "But he was among them, and so he put the facts down." This makes much more sense if we are speaking of the Gospel of Mark rather than that of Matthew. The writer is defending the authority of Mark, who, though he was not himself an apostle, was present among them, and thus was able to record their teaching. No such qualification would be necessary for Matthew. We may take it as likely, then, that Matthew's Gospel was considered the first, as Mark's Gospel is the second. Clement cites the Gospel of John repeatedly, saying, "It is written," showing that the written Gospel already had an authority akin to the Hebrew Scriptures. He also favors citations of Matthew and Luke. This may seem strange, given that Alexandria was the final resting place of Mark. If any place should exalt Mark's Gospel as first in importance or origin, it should be here. Yet the head of the Alexandrian school makes relatively little use of this Gospel. According to Eusebius, Clement wrote down a tradition which he had received from the presbyters before him in regard to the order of the Gospels. The Gospels containing the genealogies, i.e., Matthew and Luke, were written first, then Mark, and then John. It is telling that these presbyters, presumably of mid-2nd century Alexandria, knew nothing of Marcan priority, and in fact regard their patron's Gospel as third in order. Clement, as far as we know, does not say that Matthew and Luke were written first because they contain genealogies. The placement of Luke before Mark is not too surprising, since other witnesses have represented these two Gospels as more or less simultaneous, around the time of the martyrdoms of the apostles Peter and Paul. Following this, Eusebius gives an apparent direct quote from Clement. As Peter had preached the word publicly at Rome, and declared the gospel by the Spirit, many who were present requested that Mark, who had followed him for a long time, and remembered the sayings, memnemonon ton lecthanton, should write them out. And having composed the gospel, he gave it to those who had requested it. When Peter learned of this, he neither directly forbade nor encouraged it. But, last of all, John, perceiving that the external facts had been made plain in the gospel, being urged by his friends, and inspired by the Spirit, composed a spiritual gospel. This is the account of Clement. Here the Gospel of Mark is plainly said to have been written while the Apostle Peter was alive, though not in the Apostle's presence. This Gospel is primarily a recollection of the Apostle Peter's preaching. Interestingly, the Apostle did not encourage the use of this written aid to memory, perhaps because he shared that ancient preference for teaching by a living voice. In all the ancient accounts of the writing of the four Gospels, the evangelists are presented as responding to persistent requests, rather than writing on their own initiative. There appears to have been some initial reluctance to commit the oral Gospel to writing. A fragment from the first book of Origen's commentary on Matthew is quoted by Eusebius. Among the four Gospels, which are the only indisputable ones in the Church of God under heaven, I have learned by tradition that the first was written by Matthew, who was once a publican, but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, and it was prepared for the converts from Judaism, and published in the Hebrew language. The second is by Mark, who composed it according to the instructions of Peter, who in his epistle acknowledges him as a son, saying, "The church that is at Babylon elected together with you, salutes you, and so does Marcus, my son." And the third by Luke, the gospel commended by Paul, and composed for Gentile converts. Last of all that by John. If we were to evaluate the question of gospel priority on historical evidence alone, we would find no basis whatsoever for the thesis of Marcan priority, while there is abundant evidence for Matthean priority. Indeed, we cannot find any explicit statement by an author before AD 250 that some other gospel was written before Matthew's. The belief in Matthean priority cannot be attributed to its apostolic authorship, for John's gospel was widely regarded as having been written last. The historical evidence in favor of Matthean priority is sufficiently strong that we should demand a high standard of literary evidence to overturn this verdict.